Let's take the Washington National Monument down. That'll be the day. Hello to you, I'm Joe Ryan. And for those of you who are repeat visitors to the channel, you know that about a year ago I closed the channel's book of Civil War videos, have moved the focus from the generals and their battles to the deeper matter of what exactly it was that caused the war, offering the case that its efficient cause, its prime cause, the first cause, if you will, was not slavery, regardless of what the politicians of the times said and the popular historians of ours say now, but simply the presence of the Africans in the Union. To explain the objective reality of this, distinguished from the romance several generations of white historians, white teachers, and white politicians have offered, I have in the last year produced several written pieces which are published on the companion website, joeryancivil.com, and these include the slavery blame game, the Lee family slaves, Lee the slave whipper, Lee's treason, the 13th Amendment, and now take down Washington's monuments. My purpose in publishing these pieces is to give the student who is serious in his or her interest in the truth of history the opportunity to consider the history of slavery in America in its world context, the world that has turned in the hundreds, if not thousands of years of time before us, as the history of the force of human racism. A force that in the final analysis is a prime example of Darwin's theory of evolution. The point of the pieces being that the fact that between 1500 and 1800, hundreds of thousands of Africans were transported involuntarily from Africa to the Americas and spent their lives here as slaves is but an aspect of the shared experience of the great majority of human beings living on the earth during that time. The fact is that most of the human beings living their lives during that 300-year period lived in a world where they were held in bondage by overlords, whether we label the overlord king, czar, caliph, or emperor. They were tied to a plot of land, working it to produce animals and crops year after year to the end of their lives. The production from the plot owned by the overlord, who gave the tenant protection. Whether you choose to call those tied serfs, peasants, peons, the practical reality was that they were slaves. It's true, of course, I've already said it, that what makes African slavery unique in the history of this period of time is that Africans were forcibly taken from their homes and transported across an ocean to the Americas. But the force responsible for this fact is nothing more or less than the force responsible for the involuntary servitude of the masses of the serfs, peasants, and peons who populated the earth at the same time. The force of human racism, for the record indisputably shows that it was not white Europeans who wrenched the poor devils from their homes, but those who ruled over them, overlords of their own kind. But not exactly of their own kind. It was a matter of subtle distinctions among their own kind. Musai would enslave Gurma, Gurma, Busa, Busa, Barbugu, Barbugu, Dagamba, Dagamba, Bobo, Bobo, Garmo. And of these ethnic groups, these clans, as they coalesced into tribes, and tribes into confederations under the Great Asante and Zulu kings. The kings began upon the arrival of the Portuguese in 1450 to trade their slaves for rum, cloth, and metals. Then the Danes replaced the Portuguese, the Dutch the Danes, and the British the Dutch. And the islands of the Caribbean were filled up with Africans working the land to produce sugar and coffee and rum and rice, which the Europeans consumed. Then South America filled up with Africans. The economies of the process controlled during this time by the great powers of Europe, Spain, France, and Great Britain. Then, 200 years into the African diaspora, came the turn of the British monarchs, crown colonies of North America. Beginning in about 1620, the governments of the British and French monarchs authorized the movement of Africans to the Americas to include their colonies. The British along the eastern seaboard, the French into the reaches of the St. Lawrence River in Canada. 100 years later, there were approximately 2 million white Europeans living in the British American colonies, along with 200,000 Africans. Well, in Canada, during the same time, 70,000 white Europeans had migrated into that land, along with 1,500 Africans. Then came the American Revolution and the establishment of the United States of America, framed in 1789 by a Constitution that granted no power to the Union's federal government to free the Africans held in slavery by the laws of the states. From 1789 to 1865, a period of 76 years, the disease of human racism made it impossible for the white people living in the states at that time to accept the Africans living with them in their communities as citizens with equal civil rights. Abandoning the laws which recognized Africans as slaves was not an option. The historians, at a loss how to explain this history to students, devised a cover story which asserts that the war was caused by slavery, in the sense that the white people of the northern states were agitating in 1860 that the Africans be free. That agitation threatened the profitability of the southern state slave economies, and that the slave owners reacted to the agitation by orchestrating their state succession from the Union. And because the Union was deemed to be perpetual, the historians sum up, succession was not a constitutional option, justifying Lincoln when he became president in March 1861 to call forth the militias of the states to execute the laws of the Union within the territories of the succeeded states. This is poppycock, pap, for the students to swallow as more digestible than the objective truth, which is that though there were within the northern states a handful of bleeding hearts who whined incessantly that the Africans ought to be free, the supermajority of the white people living in the northern states did not care whether the Africans were free, as long as they were free someplace else. That is, not in their states, and not in the territories of the Union, which they, the white people, wish to exploit for themselves alone. Now, here we are at the latter day, the war long gone over 150 years ago, and the Africans, made by it, citizens of the United States, have struggled and strained against the malignant force of human racism, and persevered with the help of 2 world wars in Vietnam to become Americans, with the first but not the last of their kind rising to become President of the United States, and 5 of their kind now senators representing states in the Union, and 56 of them holding seats in the House of Representatives, and 1 of them an Associate Justice of the Supreme Court, and 10 of them mayors of major cities in America. So why, in the context of this historical record, are the black politicians, where they have control of local governments, using their control to take down monuments of a Confederate soldier put up by white people over 100 years ago? Why are they doing this, when all reasonable persons must know that had the table been turned and the Europeans of 1500 to 1800 were black, and the Africans of the time white, the same historical outcome would have been the result. Indeed, that had there been no human demand for sugar and coffee, or rice and rum, there would have been no spilling forth of human beings from Africa to be amalgamated into the European community of America, and thus no war between the whole white people of America, caused by their moral failure to deal with the Africans as they ought, to accept them into their communities as equal in their natural human rights. Here's a clip of a lady named Angela Rye offering with feigned emotion or pretense. Mrs. Rye grew up in Seattle, Washington, and was graduated from the University of Washington and the Seattle School of Law, and now operates as a political advocate, whatever that means, in Washington, D.C. And she appeared on CNN as a commentator in 2017 to make this pitch.
We have to get to the heart of the problem here, and the heart of the problem is the way in which many of us were taught American history. American history is not all glorious, and even though I love John to death, I couldn't disagree more about George Washington. George Washington was a slave owner, and we need to call slave owners out for what they are. Whether we think they were protecting American freedom or not, he wasn't protecting my freedom. I wasn't someone who, my ancestors weren't deemed human beings to him. And so to me, I don't care if it's a George Washington statue or a Thomas Jefferson statue or a Robert E. Lee statue, they all need to come down. There is a way that we can recognize and appreciate. I'm not finished.
You're feeding into Steve Banning and Trump's talking points.
No, but finish my point. I'm going to finish my point. I'm not feeding into white supremacy. I'm calling out white supremacy for what it is. And sometimes what it is, John, are blind spots. Sometimes what it is not acknowledging that this country was built upon a very violent past that resulted in death and the raping and the killing of my ancestors. So I'm not going to allow us to say that it's okay for a Robert E. Lee but not a George Washington. We need to call it what it is. And I'm not saying that they don't deserve to be taught about. We definitely need to learn about it so we don't repeat it, because we're very close to repeating it right now. But I'm not giving any deference to George Washington or to Robert E. Lee. Well,
how many of you have a clue what are the names of your great-grandparents, much less your great-great-grandparents? Until I was in my 40s, I had no clue. Only because of circumstance, I was able to discover the names of my great-grandparents. Of my great-great-grandparents, I still have no clue. I learned that my great-grandparents appeared in Cincinnati about 1860, having come somehow from Ireland. When exactly they came, whether they came together or alone, with parents or separately, where exactly in Ireland they were born, I have no clue. All that the record I found shows is that my great-grandmother was named Helen Considine, And in the census of 1860, it is stated she worked as a washerwoman. And that my great-grandfather was named Michael Ryan, and in the same census, it's stated he earned his living as a common laborer, which means he made his living digging ditches. Now, history informs us that the British government, in its 500-year control of Ireland, wrested most of the land away from the Irish peasants who owned it and gave it to British subjects who then rented it back to the Irish peasants, and that the Irish peasants lived off the potato patches on their plots of land. And when the potato crops began to fail in the 1840s, and the peasants, as a consequence, could not eat, much less pay their rent, the landlords threw them off the land, and they wandered about until they either got passage on what they called the coffin ships to cross the water to America, or they starved to death in the ditch. The circumstance that in the space of 10 years triggered 4 million of them to leave their native land for America. A diaspora as dismal and pathetic an experience as that of the Africans. And yet, putting myself in Mrs. Rye's shoes and working myself up to mimic her emotional rant, my mind and body fail to find the courage to pluck, to generate the emotion she predicts. Why not? Not because the African experience is more heartrending than the Irish experience. I hardly see a difference. It's because my ancestors are figments of my imagination. They are not real persons I have touched, embraced, shared the emotional ups and downs of life with, shared the good times and the bad, watched them live and die. My connection to them and to their fate is pure abstraction. And mature adults do not cry vengeance over abstractions. They do not strike stone with hammer blows in angry hate. So, Mrs. Rye is acting. She is posing, playing a part for effect. Even so, her rant about Washington and his monuments at least eliminates her from the herd of black politicians who's whining about a Confederate soldier's memorial while keeping their mouths shut about Washington's makes them hypocrites. At least Mrs. Rye has the moral courage to call a spade, whoever the spade is. Where is Illinois Senator Roland Burris in this? South Carolina Senator Tim Scott? New Jersey Senator Cory Booker, the loudmouth? Where's he? How about California Senator Kamala Harris? Whoops. Does she qualify as black? Where are the 46 black members of the House of Representatives in sharing Mrs. Rye's rant? To name a few, Maxine Waters, the old lady of L.A. who's made herself a fortune in politics. How about Mr. Clyburn, the Democrat whip, who uses the House floor as a platform to lie about Lee? Where are they with Washington? Probably they're laying back in the weeds because they know they are now Americans, full-fledged Americans, citizens of the United States, made such by the fact they are standing on the shoulders of their ancestors. For the most part, unknown faces with unknown names who carried their genes through the storm and lifted their progeny onto America's shore. Do any of them think of themselves as Ashanti or Zulu or Hutu or Tutsis or Nigerians or South Africans? No, not any more than I think I am Irish. They think of themselves as Americans, or ought to, and they know the word brings with it an American history that is their own. The good, the bad, and the ugly, and none of it can be rewritten, erased, or ignored. It is their American heritage as much as it is mine. Because the Civil War has made us all Americans now. Who among us really wants to abandon our mutually shared American history for our ancestors' roots in Ireland or Africa? Not me, and probably not you. The Washington National Monument stands like a sentinel before an ancient temple, pointing to the sun. It is the tallest obelisk standing in the world. As its history shows, if anyone cares enough to understand it, it was not so much raised in memory of Washington, but raised as the symbol of the Union's national government. A government created, in the main, in all respects, by the elite white propertied class of the Royal Crown Colony and Dominion of Virginia, the White Virginians, who lived in 1776. The Union's federal government was framed by the Virginians' plan in the abstraction and made real by Washington's leadership of the people to live under it. First, in his capacity as the general commanding their army of revolution to wrest the continent from the grip of the British Empire, and then second, in his capacity as their first president, transforming the paper plan into a reality. But, as Mrs. Rye declaims, we are certainly capable of taking the monument down tomorrow if we Americans wish. We can make it disappear as easily as the black politicians in Dallas and New Orleans and Baltimore have made Lee's disappear. We just erect a scaffold around it and down it comes, stone by stone, until it's gone and there's nothing left, just an empty space for those who come after us to wonder at.